this part of Cape Cod is really basically the sand jetty that was at the end of the glacier that formed this whole area. And so it's extremely fragile. Well, this is the edge of the town proper of Provincetown. As you can see, the water comes very close to the land. During storms, this water will come right over the road. Flooding is sort of a constant part of our existence here. In general, Cape Cod is losing about 3 feet of land a year. This road is called Snail Road. When I was a child, it went shore to shore, and if you follow through that opening there in the trees, you could go straight across the dunes all the way to the ocean. They closed it up because the large dunes that were there are very fragile, and as more and more people started traversing them, they began to beat them down. As you can see, it's 3,205 miles to Bishop, California. This is the longest highway in the country. You can see the dunes on the other side of the highway. They're constantly encroaching. During storms, that side of the highway will sometimes fill in completely with sand and has to be dug out. Really, we're just borrowing this place from the beach. This is the entrance for dune dwellers to the dunes. So if you can imagine how fragile the littoral section of the town is, like any beach community. But out here, it takes on an entirely new meaning. Instead of the adaptation that society normally makes to basically create the semblance of a controlled and contained environment where nature is sort of held in check, out here, the people who settled out here took an entirely different approach. And the hardy people who built dwellings out here, in a way, almost surfed on the dunes. This illustrates what I was talking about. If you look at that shack over there, and as you can see, it's built on pilings. And that's a necessity because the dunes will come and go. And one year you can be floating in the air, and the next year you can risk having your entire dwelling buried. Dune dwellers, they live out here in a kind of impermanence which actually works well. The idea of trying to build a solid house in this shifting sand is not really possible, and the best way to deal with the environment is to make an adaptive structure that is able to shift and float on the sand, so that if the dunes move away from you one winter, your building remains standing. So originally this was a deciduous forest which had developed over millennia on top of the glacial sand deposit. When the English settlers came, they logged this area so heavily that they destabilized the surface. And once the sand was allowed to upwell from the ground and displace the soil, the forests here were wiped out. And they were barely able to control it at all to keep the town itself. And this area became a microclimate, basically a desert, and has been such ever since. All of this area that you see was targeted, and plans were drawn up and deals were being cut to turn it all into a oceanside, Atlantic City, Coney Island style amusement park. A number of artists and political activists, led by my mother and the painter Ross Moffat, basically somehow or another, miraculously, because there were large money interests involved against it, convinced the town to donate this land to the National Seashore Park, which Kennedy was aggressively expanding at the time. And so the Provincetown National Seashore was born as part of a movement to preserve much of Cape Cod's natural beauty, which the Kennedys were very interested in, having come from here. People who lived out here, the dune dwellers, were of course as fervent supporters of this initiative as anybody. And there were scattered throughout the dunes artists, writers, all kinds of sort of people channeling the spirit of Henry David Thoreau and living out here in the nature with no amenities whatsoever. That is our entire set of amenities, which is our outhouse. Basically, it's sand and protection from the weather, that's it. So we're coming up on Frenchie's shack. Frenchie was an amazing character. She was a gypsy living in the sewers of Paris. She was discovered and brought to Broadway as a showgirl. And while she was a showgirl on Broadway, she became friends with another beautiful young woman named Betty Davis. And they decided to come here on vacation one summer. And Frenchie fell in love with the place. Betty loved it too, but she went back to Broadway and eventually ended up in Hollywood. Frenchie stayed here. Talking about this whole impermanence of dwellings, this is not the original shack. My father and I built this when I was 18, and the original shack slowly got progressively buried. And also of interesting note, on this shack site, originally was a Coast Guard station that, once it was no longer used by the Coast Guard, was occupied by Eugene O'Neill, and he wrote some of his important plays here. And what was funny was when we were building this, we actually did some excavation to put in pilings to float the rebuilding of the shack, and we found below Frenchie's shack springs and mattresses from the original turn of the century Coast Guard installation, which Eugene O'Neill had later occupied. And so this shack is floated like a wharf on top of the original shack.
So it's just been taken over?
Yeah, well, the sand is constantly moving and things need to be dug out all the time. See that sagging structure all the way back? That's actually the original shack that Frenchie basically made out of driftwood. And that is the tradition here, to build out of as much found material as possible to kind of blend in with the environment. There's a tremendous amount of sea wrack which drifts ashore and can be used in various ways. As you can see, even the lock has to have a little piece of cloth over it to protect it from the sand, because if the sand can get in here, it'll just grit up the lock in no time. This is what we refer to as the studio, and also serves as an overflow bedroom up in the eaves there. But mostly that's just when there's extra children or friends or whatnot staying over. This is the main part of the shack. When my kids were little, my son and I would share one bed and my daughter would have the other one. But now, basically, that's for my daughter. It's the private room. There's a curtain here. And then my son and I will share these two beds. At various times, we've had hammocks, and after a while, they become primary ingredients for mouse nests in the winter. When we rebuilt the shack in '77, we tried to preserve as much of the original structure as possible. You want a kitchen that is somewhere where you can cook when there's no light, because all you have is candles and gas lamps, so simpler is better. This is just an old camp stove and an old sink that I have a bucket in, and when the bucket fills up, I dump the water out. And of course the water comes from the pump, and we carry it in 1-gallon containers. See, this is a pot of water here that I gathered earlier. When we're done, I'll boil this water and wash and disinfect my dishes and drain them out. I keep most of the dishes upright that I'm using because there's a large population of mice who live here. And one of Frenchie's rules is that no animals can be killed, so you have to even live in harmony with the mice. That this is where we keep all our paper goods, toilet paper, paper towels, anything the mice might think would be attractive has to be kept in there, because they haven't figured out how to open the door yet in 50 years.
So a refrigerator actually is not a refrigerator.
No, it's just a mice-free closet. It's a micerator. And you use tins and things like that. You don't bring a lot of perishables out here because there's no refrigeration.
But you can eat meals. I mean,
Yes, cook all the time. Simple things. I bring out basic ingredients, cheese, bread, fruit, or I'll make pasta. There is no running water here. We have a pump outside, and you can only really draw water when the tide is high. The groundwater floats on top of the salt water because of the density. And so our fresh water rises and falls in the column of sand. This is the pump. The pipe is about 28 feet down, basically close to the water line. It's a bubble of fresh water that floats right above the seawater. It usually takes about a gallon to prime this, and it will stay primed for only a few minutes because it's not like a normal well. It's almost like a piece of a cult to convince water to rise out of the sand at this point. But it will stay primed as long as you keep using it. There's a certain magical quality to be sitting in all of this arid sand on the edge of the ocean and be pulling the freshest, sweetest water you ever drank out of the sand. It's a pretty incredible thing. Here it comes. All right, that's dune water. It's a little rusty at first, and then it'll come out pure. There we go. It's beautiful water. Right here on the edge of the sand. It's amazing.
it's pretty basic.
Yeah, it's simple. We were talking about Thoreau, when he lived on Walden Pond. One of the principles was that there wasn't a large man-nature divide. They were the first really to be bridging this philosophical concept that we were of nature, and that sort of the extent of how well we expressed our existence was to what extent we were basically a harmonious and integrated part of that life. Although it's not something that, is like a guiding principle of mine in terms of Thoreau's thinking, I do feel this idea that it's not man or nature. I think that man is probably doing best when his relevance to nature is sort of understood and perceptible. I don't think that everybody can or should necessarily live in the wilderness. Anyone who studies any kind of system, whether it's a natural system or scientific system, will always tell you that diversity is inherent and it's also an expression of strength and resilience. So having people who basically are willing and able to keep this kind of life going and live like this, not just because it's in an isolated third world environment where there are no other options, but to actively choose to experience life like this. I think that's probably important. All right, let's do some beachcombing. So this is the ocean, Atlantic Ocean, nothing between here and Spain.
Wow, it's the end of the land.
Well, these are called the outermost houses. And if you look over there, you see the Pilgrim Monument. A lot of people don't realize that the Pilgrims landed here first in Provincetown, not in Plymouth. And while they were here, really trying to sort out the terrible mess they were in because they'd gone way off course. They'd meant to be in Virginia. They'd meant to arrive much sooner. It was November, it was cold. They were basically in the wrong place. And they sat in Provincetown Harbor and they made a unique decision which shaped the entire course of history of this country. They decided to dispense with the English caste system, and every person was equal. They wrote a thing called the Mayflower Compact, and it was a start down a road towards representative democracy. This is the great beach that Thoreau wrote about in his book on Cape Cod. A lot of what he observed about the nature of what was going on and the visual aspect and the isolation, it's pretty much unchanged. There's a pod of seals over there. There's a continuous stream of feeding seals here, just as he observed. Because of Frenchie's efforts, the birds have been returning to lay nests here my whole life. The North Atlantic tern. They have one of the longest migration paths. And you can see them, there's one right there. And when it gets cold, they'll fly south, all the way to South America. But they come here to breed, and this particular population of terns has been doing this since I was a child, and they're here because they were protected, because they could successfully nest here. Because this is fairly inaccessible, you can see that it's also relatively, there's nobody here. So we're going to come up on a little grouping of shacks, some of the few remaining other dune dweller shacks. These properties were originally squatted. You know, this wasn't a town, this wasn't really part of the town. The people who lived out here partook of a kind of permanence and impermanence at the same time. That was understood when the park was created, but as the National Seashore has become more of a bureaucracy directed from afar, it's become less responsive to this particular individual environment. And so large macro solutions have been sought with wonderful motivations. The idea being that they're trying to protect the nature and the fragile environment. But the shacks, the few people who live out here, are not in conflict with that nature. And in fact, they have preserved it. They've been its caretakers. This shack here in the middle was Harry Kemp's shack. He was known as the poet of the dunes. And at one point, he had a very celebrated literary career in the 1920s. His wife died young, and he became a recluse out here, writing and living much of the year out here, and my father would take care of him. In a normal home, we are protected. In a normal town. Even in a rural environment, the worlds that we create now are safer, more stable, more structured. These shacks are a way of bridging a distance that we don't normally get to do anymore, where in here, this sense of impermanence, this sense of the power and the immediacy of this very primal kind of nature, it has a huge impact on how you feel your way through the world.
This resembles Thoreau's cabin in size.
Yeah.
Is that part of the point?
You know, Harry was practically contemporary of Thoreau. He came only about 30 or so years later.
And is part of this out here the idea to live deliberately and to...
Yes. You know, a lot of artistic processes are about trying to take in as much as you can and eliminating what's not absolutely necessary, so that the artist's experience becomes a filter for life.
Tell me what you know about this one.
Well, it's pretty much the way it was. It's the same, you know, the shacks are not allowed to be changed by the National Seashore. We cannot enlarge them or change them. We can't add amenities. Unfortunately, there's two pieces of legislation about housing out here which are directly in contradiction. One is that the shacks have to remain exactly as they are, and the other one states that no building is allowed to remain unless it's improved. This is another bureaucratic catch-22, where you have these beautiful places which should not be changed, owned by people who don't want to change them, and embraced by codes in the national park which protect these structures as they are, as should be done. We all embrace that idea. Unfortunately, unimproved property is not allowed to be retained. So there is always a pretext to destroy any shack that they so choose. A lot of these rules are designed to protect people from being basically deposited in living situations which are unsustainable or untenable. But ironically, a lot of these smaller, more alternative dwellings are actually very sustainable in certain environments. And a lot of this legislation and building codes and rules are not actually responsive to the environments in which some people find themselves in, or the economic situations that some people are in. And it's unfortunate. It is a case of good intentions doing terrible things, and it happens. And this issue, if it was presented in an environment where people were actually able to talk to each other, would be a very bipartisan issue, because there's elements about property ownership and individual rights which conservatives celebrate, and there's elements about protection of fragile economies, fragile ways of life, artistic communities, and that sort of thing, which liberals can embrace. So there's something in this for everybody. It would just be an expression of what was originally intended when all this was founded. The whole idea of shelter in this context is not protection, but the ability to expose yourself to this environment and have as much of this environment make contact with you as possible. There's this wind-blown, weathered, beaten, eroded quality to everything out here, which, since this is my earliest childhood playground, I fell in love with and think of as natural and kind of an expression of some kind of pure essence. When I was a small child, I had this red fire truck that somehow had washed up on the beach out here, except for that all the parts, of course, had been stripped off, and it was no longer fire truck red, but a kind of winey rose color from being bleached by the sun and battered by the ocean. Like this, I remember finding toys like this on the beach, and by their incompleteness, they acquired a kind of animated magic, which a brand new shiny toy just couldn't have. And whereas if you found something like this in a normal urban or semi-urban environment, you would think it was disgusting. Out here, because everything is bleached and purified by the wind and the waves and the water and the sand, everything takes on the quality that a sandblasted beach glass has. It's sort of elevated to a new level of existence. If you look at these doors, you can see what happens here, and believe me, this glass is not that old, but it just gets weathered because the action of the wind and sand is just incredible here. I board this up in the winter to protect it, but even so, this porch will completely fill with sand. I see a lot this idea of a cumulative experience, and people feel basically driven to increase in size, increase in complexity, increase in acquisition. There's the things that everyone talks about, like the media distractions of the internet, but it really goes beyond that, because even if the internet didn't exist, the idea of worrying about your lawn or your car or your furniture, or this experience completely sweeps that away. Here, you assess things in terms of how will they stand up to a windstorm. And that really is the yardstick you use, and it's the only one that matters. And the other thing is, how harmonious is it with this whole experience? There is only so much luxury that living like this can accommodate successfully without being completely inappropriate and basically useless. And that's a good thing. We are so bombarded in our daily lives with so much access to information. This experience, it is by its very nature purifying, and purifying experiences allow you to focus. It's a huge list of people who've been influenced by this environment. It's like a who's who of artists in America and writers who've worked and lived out here. His short list would include people like Norman Mailer, Franz Klein, Jackson Pollack, Mark Rothko, John dos Passos. Any figure who has a kind of important status in this developmental post-war American period, they probably were out here. I can imagine in some way there must be a relationship between the experience you have in a little house like this and what it must be like to be in a spaceship orbiting Earth, where your horizons are both cramped and vast. This, in a way, is a capsule, and we're in this enormous space. It's both a small space and a big space, because short of going to the Midwest, you can't get a larger horizon. There are people who think the idea of enduring difficult circumstances like climbing Mount Everest is a wonderful thing, and I'm glad for them, but that's not my thing. I'm not a survivalist. I just love the beauty. I'm not out to prove anything. I enjoy pleasure, I enjoy beautiful things, and I think that this shack is very comfortable. I don't think of it as a difficult endurance. I don't find it hard to live here. You know, yeah, I have to wash my dishes by hand and there's no electricity. But that's not a huge problem, because when I'm out here, if you spend a day outside in fresh air and you're swimming and collecting driftwood and sculpting and drawing and reading and writing, I'm going to close up because I'm not going to be back until Monday. Okay. You know, by the time the light goes at 9:30 and you have a late dinner because you use as much of the natural light as possible, and then you eat, have a couple of glasses of wine, you're done. You're ready for bed. This is more for the wind than it is for security. And also, when dawn comes around, every hour that you miss out here, it pains you because you're missing so much beauty every single day. Okay. You're basically reduced to speechlessness, and it happens every day.